Here. Now we'll bring it up. There we go. So let's go back to the beginning. Again, concerned about the romanticizing of the early Celtic life. It was hard, it was work, it was uncertain. But as we move forward, one of the questions we have to look at is, who were these Celts and where did they come from? And based on the early models of archaeology, the evidence of the older models showed that the Celts basically were centered in Central Europe, and that they then migrated over into France and into Britain during the first millennium BCE. They were a culture, in essence, that was put together based on abstract patterns of their artwork and stylized animals. There were probably many just independent tribes, but they shared that in common. There are also fierce warriors. The earliest use of the word Celt was from the Greek writings. And actually, the Celts sacked Rome in 390 BCE. They dominated Europe and invaded Britain and France around 200 BCE. The newer genetic research shows that the origin of the Celts was probably in Turkey, and then they migrated along the Mediterranean and up through the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, and then up into Great Britain that way. So different from the original model, but either way, for us, what's important is that they ended up in the British Isles around 200 BCE. And at the time of the Roman invasion into the British Isles, tribes inhabited Scotland, including people later known as the Picts, which meant painted ones. And the Picts were extremely fierce warriors and created such a problem for Rome, for the Roman legions, that they actually built what's called Hadrian's Wall across the Britain continent to wall out the Picts to the north, and then those to the south were Romanized in southern Britain. And along with this, probably from Gaul came missionaries with the Roman legions that began and brought the Christian faith into Britain. Now, over on the west side of Britain and Ireland, eventually the faith spread out there, but they were pretty much left alone. And so there's a really strong Roman influence in the center part of Britain. And as it moved out to the urban churches, those people there began to understand the faith as it was seen by monastics. So the monastery itself was often the center of the populace around. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But many of the early missionaries were probably slaves that had been to Ireland, who had been captured in Britain and then taken to Ireland. And you all know probably the most famous one is Patrick. He was 6 years, as the story goes, a slave in Ireland, and then escaped and went back to Britain, was ordained, and then came back and returned as a missionary to Ireland. I think one of the things that is best known is St. Patrick's breastplate. Everyone sings it in church. It's actually a very long chanted prayer. And the story goes that the High King of Ireland and Tara, that's where the king was located, once a year, all of the fire within Ireland was extinguished. There was no fire. And then at the Tara, the king lit the fire, and then fire was taken out to all the rest of Ireland. You think about a power play, I mean, no light, no way to cook food, anything, and out comes this fire. Well, Patrick didn't go along with that. He was always a little obstinate with the Druids. And of course, the king, that was the official, quote, religion at the time. So here's everything in the dark. And over on this hill is this big bonfire. And that was Patrick. And so Patrick, the decision was made, they needed to get rid of this problem. And there were warriors waiting to ambush them. But as Patrick was going along, he was singing this prayer, and it's called a lorca, that is a prayer of protection. And so he's singing it, and this, as the story goes, when he and the other monks passed by the warriors who were going to ambush them, all the warriors saw was a stag and doe and fawns and just this deer moving along. And so they passed through safely. And so that's the story of St. Patrick and the breastplate as the protective prayer. So we have this timeline. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. It just gives you an idea of what was happening. We, of course, got Paul converting the Galatians. And then we move forward. Constantine, we now have an official state religion. And you've got the desert mothers and fathers developing. And of course, their teachings were spread. And you've got Martin in Gaul and his apprentice Ninian, who then were some of the early missionaries to Britain and to eventually to Ireland. Remember that the Roman troops had to withdraw from Britain because Rome was being under siege. And at that time, then the Anglo-Saxons came in, and basically what happened is over on the west side of Britain and in Ireland, the church just continued on its own developing. And then in main part of Britain, the Anglo-Saxons destroyed most of the monasteries that were there at the time. But then eventually we have this mission of basically inspired by the early desert mothers and fathers. You have this mission to plant other missions within Britain. And Columba, of course, spreads mission communities out from Iona and Scotland. Even Wales was kind of a golden era of planting missions. And of course, in Ireland itself, you had Patrick and Bridget and Brendan and Columba. They all started large communities. And then as we move along, you'll see, for instance, Columbanus, who founded missions out into Europe. And things had grown large enough that Rome said, okay, we need a bishop there, get this thing organized. And they sent Augustine. And Augustine was developing this national church following the design that had grown up in Rome. And it was just very different from the church that had developed organically in Ireland and the western edge of Britain. And a lot of issues, many of them were the issues of women's activity within the church. the Celts saw no problem with women leadership. And of course, Rome did. There only men could be leaders. The whole theology, in a sense, and I use the term in quotes, theology, the Celtic church saw God way beyond any walls of a church. God was everywhere in all people. As they would say, the light of Christ was in each person. It might get covered up a little bit, but it was still there. It never was quenched. And of course, the Roman approach was, we've got the church, you be baptized, then you come in. And the Celts basically said, God's in everyone. How can you not be recognizing this person just because they're not baptized yet? So there were many decisions that had to be discussed. Of course, the one that they talk about the most is that they had different calendars. And so the issue was, when is Easter? And it was really a family argument that caused it. King Oswey, who was the king of Northumbria, his wife was raised in the Roman church and he was raised in the Celtic church. And so when he'd be feasting, she'd be fasting. And you can imagine the table conversation that occurred there. And so finally it had enough of all of this going on about tonsures. Do you have a curve here, or do you shave from here with long hair back, which was the Celtic way? There were just all these differences. And he said, okay, we need to get this straightened out. So he called for the Synod of Whitby. And Augustine presented the Roman approach, and Coleman actually presented the Celtic approach. And the king listened to everything, and then at the end decided that the Roman way was the way that everyone was going to go. And with that, Cuthbert, who was heading up Lindisfarne, which was a large monastic area over on the east coast of England, just at the Scottish border in Northumbria, and Hilda, actually the sister of the king, had a monastery at Whitby. And so they went along with it, but there were many who didn't, and they went off over to Ireland. And so in Ireland, the Celtic church continued for much longer than the rest of Britain. The monasteries themselves served as centers of learning and healing, friendship, solitude, spiritual mentors, and they really were the center for many of the small towns or that would grow up around them. And so the people out there really learned a form of Christianity that was very monastic in terms of praying the hours of the day, and that work is wrapped in prayer. These were all points that they learned from the Celtic monks. And so they went and accepted these approaches in terms of their life, in their own prayer life. Again, coming in from the early desert mothers and fathers, you see the pattern of set for seeking God, a withdrawal, and set apart, practice the gift of silence. Hospitality was a very important thing to the early Celtic monastics, and then charity and compassion. And of course, the meditation on and study of scripture, holy writings, was very important. And so we can look at how the actual desert spirituality was expressed within the church, the Celtic church. As I've said, there was this understanding that God was present in all of creation, and that the Gospel of John was the center of their focus in terms of study. And the reason being that they reasoned that John at the Last Supper was seen leaning on Christ's breast, listening to the heartbeat of God. And so therefore his writing should be prominent and studied. Where with the Roman church, it was Peter, the rock on which the church was built. So again, two very different approaches to how one looked at scripture and how one looked spiritually at the world around them. Again, the Roman church had this hierarchical design based on Roman political system, really, bishops, dioceses, and so on. And then the Celtic church had friendship. That was the glue that held the Celtic monasteries together. And the word we used there was Anamchara, which means soul friend. And this was a way in which two monastics, two religious, would support one another, serving as companion, mentor, spiritual director, confessor. So there were these very close bonds that were made that didn't separate, because if one of the individuals went off to form a new mission, because of the monasteries would grow, and at a point they'd say, okay, we're going to send out more brothers or sisters to form a mission over here. Well, that relationship still continued, this Anamchara relationship, even though they were separated by distance. And that was the glue that held the early Celtic church, the monasteries, together. And again, there was this sense of it was God who loves and supports and is closely at hand and actually present in our lives. God was as close as a breath. And the sense of being embraced on all sides by God in such a way that Emmanuel was no longer a word, but actually was reality to them. God present, Jesus present, was real. And I wanted to take a moment and look at some of the characteristics of the Celtic spirituality. Again, this sense of the goodness of creation, the very positive aspect in their spirituality and God and humanity. The idea that there are places, and we call them thin places, but very few these places where the spiritual and the worldly, or term profane, are interwoven. And those are areas that people recognize that when you get to this spot, for instance, you can really feel and sense that presence of the Spirit being very close to you. And again, this whole idea of the positiveness, the heart is vibrant with God's life. And it's actually referred to as God is a life within life. Again, all of creation is good. And while it can get covered up, it's still there and is recognized as being good. We talked about God's life, the vibrancy of it, being the sense of immediacy of the spiritual realm around you is part of the Celtic spirituality. You're surrounded at all times, thin places. And the relationship was so important in the Celtic church and the Celtic Christian. Family, clan, family was extremely important. Kin, neighbors, enemy. It was all about relations and how we relate to one another. Esther de Waal, who in her book, Celtic Way of Prayer, makes the statement, everyone sees themselves in relation to one another, and that extends beyond human beings to the wild creatures, the birds, the animals, the earth itself. This has brought a sense of being a part of the whole web of being. I particularly like that. I wanted to share it with you. And then Norman MacLeod wrote that the whole of God's dwelling place and all of creation bore within itself the renewing of God's grace. Not just that God's grace was confined to the church or the sacraments, but went way beyond that. And then in the 1800s, we owe a great debt and thanks to Alexander Carmichael. And Alexander, I truly believe, was a call from God, recognized that all of these prayers and blessings and poems and songs were been handed down by oral tradition, and that it was being lost. And so what he did was he just went around the British Isles talking with people. He'd sit maybe at a pub or at some croft, a farm is a croft, in the kitchen and say, tell me about the prayers your grandmother taught you, or tell me about the songs or the poetry. And he'd just write it down. And so we basically have a 6-volume set of these poems, songs, prayers, blessings called the Carmina Gadelica. And it's because of this that we have access to these early prayers. Otherwise, I think most of them wouldn't be here now. We also have to understand the Celtic concept of pilgrimage, which was very different from our idea or even the idea in the Middle Ages. And let's look at the Middle Ages as an example. You went on pilgrimage, let's say from England to Jerusalem. Now that, and then back. For the Celtic Christian, it wasn't about the end point. What it was about was the journey. And this was to the point that they didn't even worry about where they were going. For instance, monastics would get in a coracle, which was a leather covered circular boat for the most part. Some were more like a canoe, but they would just head off and let wherever the wind would blow, that's where God wanted them. And so there was this whole understanding that we are on this journey, and where we're going to end up doesn't matter. What's important is that along this journey, we recognize and listen to God and where God is. And those who set out were passionate, and they had convictions that they must undertake this journey. And they understood they were being led by the Spirit, and they were seeking a place. For them, it was internal journey as well, in that they were seeking a place of resurrection, the resurrection of self, the true self, which is what is really the true home for all of us. And so Columbanus wrote, and I love this part of it, the end of the road is the end of our life. The end of our roadway is our home. And that was the whole idea of life's journey. And so as we move into looking at journeys, I want to share some prayers with you. And this is a first one, looking at life again as a journey from birth to death. Also, there are daily journeys, long journeys, all kinds of journeys. But here we have the gospel of God of life, to shelter thee, to aid thee. Yea, the gospel of the beloved Christ, the holy gospel of the Lord, to keep thee from all malice, from every dole and door, to keep thee from all spite, from evil eye and anguish. Thou shalt travel thither and hath traveled hither, and thou shalt travel hill and headlong. Thou shalt travel down and thou shalt travel up. Thou shalt travel oceans and narrow. Christ himself, a shepherd over thee, enfolding thee on every side. He will not forsake thee, hand or foot, nor let evil come anigh thee. And again, it demonstrates first the envision and embodiment of the Trinity and of the experience of God always surrounding the person. And here is a prayer for journey that comes from Mary MacDonald, a crofter. And this was one that her great-grandmother taught her. And God be with thee every pass. Jesus, he thee at every hill. Spirit, he with thee on every stream, headlong and ridge and lawn. Each sea and land, each moor and meadow, lying down, each rising up. In the trough of the waves and the crest of the billows, each step of the journey thou goest. Again, the constant understanding that God is there, the Trinity is there surrounding us. And here's a prayer that coming up that a mother would whisper in the ear of her daughter as they left, or she left for a journey, either long or short. Be the great God between thy two shoulders to protect thee in thy going and in thy coming. Be the Son of Mary, Virgin, near thine heart, and be the perfect Spirit upon thee pouring. Oh, the perfect Spirit upon thee pouring. Again, the implicit of the Trinity just there, never questioned, never doubted. It was just part of who you were. And here is an example of a prayer that would be used either when you were working with stock up on the pasture or fishermen heading out to fish, invoking the Trinity when they headed out. The three who are over me, the three who are below me, the three who are above me here, the three who are above me yonder, the three who are earthly, the three who are in the air, the three who are in heaven, the three who are in the great pouring sea. And a Christian Celt was immersed in prayer from the moment of their birth. And this is a birthing prayer. It would be done immediately upon the birth of the child. It would be said by the mother or the midwife. And it would be, again, the family and the neighbors would all gather around the hearth and the child. And this is what would be said. The little drop of the Father on thy little forehead, beloved one. The little drop of the Son on thy little forehead, beloved one. The wee drop of the Spirit on the wee forehead of the beloved one. To aid from all phase, to shield thee from the host, to keep thee from the known, to shield thee from the spectra, to keep thee from the three, to shield thee, to surround thee, to save thee for the three, to fill thee with the graces, the little drop of the three. And then about 7 days later, the child was taken to actually have the church's blessing. And here is a prayer when starting the day. We would start out with, bless me, O God, my soul, my body. Bless Tom, O God, my belief and my condition. Bless to me, O God, my heart and my speech. And bless to me, O God, the handling of my hand. strength in the busyness of the morning, habit and temper of modesty, force and wisdom of thought, and thine own path, O God of virtues, till I go to sleep this night. Thine own path, O God of virtues, till I go to sleep this night. Again, the partnership with God, being surrounded constantly. And then there were working prayers for the loom. When you were weaving, they prayed in the name of the person as they were weaving the cloth for them. There were prayers for churning cream into butter. Prayers said for planting the fields. You gardeners, did you know that you only plant seed on Friday? Because the reason is Jesus died on Friday, was buried, and rose again. The seed is dead, you bury the seed, and the seed will rise again. So planting was done on Friday. But here we have, God bless thou thy reaping. Here's harvest. Each ridge and plain and field, each sickle curved, shapely, hard, each ear and handful of the sheaf. And here's one of my favorites. It's a prayer for milking the cow. Bless, O God, my little cow. Bless, O God, my desire. Bless thou my partnership in the milking of my hands, O God. Bless, O God, each teat. Bless, O God, each finger. Bless thou each drop that goes into my little pitcher, O God. And I wanted to share this picture with you. This is what a hearth would look like in one of the craft cottages. And you'll see here, this area here, this is peat that's been placed to bank the fire, to keep embers hot, so that the fire can be rekindled in the morning. And so, as would not surprise you, there's a prayer for banking the fire at night. The sacred three: to save, to shield, to surround, the hearth, the house, the household. This eve, this night, oh, this eve, this night, and every night and every single night. Amen. And so the woman of the house, when she banked the fire, would pray this prayer. And then in the morning, fire had to be rekindled. And so she would pray, I will kindle my fire this morning in the presence of the holy angels of heaven, in the presence of Ariel, the loveliest form, in the presence of Uriel, the married charms, without malice, without jealousy, without envy, without fear, without terror, or any other under the sun, but the Holy Son of God to shield me, without malice, without jealousy, without envy, without fear, without terror, or anyone under the sun, but the Holy Son of God to shield me. So that was when she was actually physically banking or igniting, rekindling the fire. But then the prayer goes on to rekindle the fire within her. God, kindle thou in my heart within a flame of love for my neighbor, to my foe, to my friend, to my kindred all, to the brave, the knave, and the thaw. O Son, the loveliest Mary, from the lowliest thing that liveth to the name that is highest of all. O Son, the loveliest Mary, from the lowliest thing to liveth to the name of the highest of all. And there were prayers when the the men of the cottage would head out in the dawn. They would take off their caps and they would look at the sun and pray, the eye of the great glory, the eye of the King of hosts, the eye of the King of the living, pouring upon us, each time and season pouring upon us, gently and generously. Glory to thee, thou glorious Son, face of the God of life. And because the moon was important, to be able to see on the roads, to handle your boat in the night, there was a prayer for the moon. I'm lifting thee my hands, I'm bowing thee my head, I'm giving thee my love, thou glorious jewel of all ages. I'm raising to thee mine eye, I'm bending to thee my head, I'm offering to thee my love, thou new moon of all ages. And then there are prayers when people would depart. And this prayer is actually one that my community uses. It's, may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever he may send you. May he guide you through the wilderness, protect you through the storm. May he bring you home rejoicing at the wonders he has shown you. May he bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. And at this point, I'm going to stop sharing here. And why am I seeing Dick's iPad here? Let's go to gallery. There we go. I've been asked to just say a few things about monastics or religious, both are the same term, and then a little bit about the Anamchara Fellowship. And this will just be a short thumbnail because it was requested. Probably at some point, maybe we should do a program on this as well. But the first thing when people ask me about being a religious, the first thing I want them to understand is that a monastic or a religious is no different from any of you. We are simply people who are trying to figure out and found a way to live their baptismal vows, just the same as each of you. It's to find a way to live in relationship with God and one another. You're individuals who responded to God's call to live a consecrated and contemplative life within community. And those communities can either be residential or they can be dispersed. My community is a dispersed community, but we're out in the world. One thing that a religious has is a rule of life. When we use the term rule, we're not talking, well, people immediately think of a yardstick or a ruler. But in the time when they use that term rule, they were talking about a straight edge. And it would be used to draw a straight line. And that's what a rule of life provides, is this line that you're walking. And it can be the rule of life of an individual, or it could be a community's rule of life. But having that lets you know if you're heading off to one side or the other and get back on the line. And it's not a legalistic, it's not a rule that if you break this, you're going to be punished. It's simply a guide. And the Anamchara Fellowship itself, as I mentioned earlier, Anamchara is the term soul friend in Gaelic or Irish language, depending on who you talk to. Ireland, they want to be called the Irish language. Otherwise, it's Gaelic. And it means soul friend. It was a way in which, to begin with, it was a way in which an individual was brought into the early monastic order or community. And that is that they were paired up with a professed member of the community who then served as a mentor and guide as their support, helping them to learn how to live as a monastic or a religious. And somewhere on here, I don't see her right now, but there is Sister Cassandra Grace, who is actually my Anamchara. In 2010, when I started, she was the one who brought me into formation and turned me into who I am as a monastic, which I'm very thankful. We still get together every Sunday night together on Zoom as well. We are, as I mentioned, a dispersed community. So we have members all over the US, and we stay connected through Zoom, and before that, Skype. Long before COVID, we were using this to pray together, to meet, to talk, to be formed. And we also have members in Scotland and in Hungary and in Brazil. At this point, if you consider all of the people who are like companions, and we'll talk about that in a moment, or aspirants or postulants is another word, or novices or professed, there's about 90 of us in our community at this point. And we are recognized by the Episcopal Church, by the House of Bishops Committee on Religious Life, has recognized us as a religious community within the Episcopal Church. And we have a bishop visitor who is actually the Bishop of Western Missouri. And she is there to support us and to guide us as well. Our members can live singly or partnered with families. Some of our members in the past have shared a house together. But we're out in the world and dispersed. Our vows are those of simplicity, fidelity, and obedience. And our charisms, the gifts that we use in ministry, are those of hospitality, generosity, compassion, and love. And members of our community are involved in ministries of pastoral care, or teaching, catechesis, or teaching, and spiritual direction. And for example, I'm a hospital chaplain. Our orders, our community is a little different in that every 3 years we renew our vows. And the reason we've chosen that is, or was chosen when we were founded, is that we recognize that the Spirit can lead somebody onto a different path, and that there are times when a vowed member needs to follow a different path. If you've made life vows, now you have to go and ask to be released from those vows. And this sometimes can cause hurt and distress for both the community and the individual who's leaving. And we didn't want any part of that. So every 3 years, a person, if they feel God's heading them somewhere else, they just don't renew their vows. And we have a service in which we celebrate them. We give thanks for their time with us, and we send them off with our blessing in a very joyful, positive way. And so that's why we renew every 3 years. And our abbot or abbess is also elected every 3 years. This gives the Holy Spirit an opportunity to be involved in the leadership, much more involved in the leadership, by physically allowing, through prayer, the brothers and sisters and siblings to choose who they recognize God is calling to lead the community. And the abbot is the spiritual and administrative leader of the community. If you look at Benedict's rule of life, and this one scared the daylights out of me, it says the abbot is responsible for the souls of the members of the community. So I don't think I'm quite there yet, but it's a ministry, a pastoral ministry of listening and helping members of the community, and administratively helping with the organization of the community. And as we grow, there's more and more that needs to be done. So that's kind of in a nutshell, life as a religious, the Anamchara Fellowship, and what is it about this being an abbot. So at this point, I'm opening it up for questions or thoughts. So please raise your hand. Michael's going to be serving as the MC for this part of it. And so you need to raise your hand on using Zoom if you can. If you can't figure that out, just frantically raise in front. We'll try and spot you, but we have more than just.
Yeah, you have to look at the other pictures to see if anybody's up.
I've left you all speechless, I can tell.
Amanda wants to speak.
Okay, Amanda.
You mentioned part of your vow was obedience. I wonder who are you swearing obedience to?
Sure. First of all, to God.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's number one. Next would be the abbess or abbot. And when we swear obedience as a vow, we recognize that the abbot or abbess, if they're doing what they should be doing, are in discernment with God or listening to God. So their actions are God working through them. That's the way we approach obedience. It's also obedience to the bishop of the diocese in which we are resident, and obedience to the priest of the congregation in which we're a resident. Now, having said this, I don't think we've ever had anyone ask a member of our community to do something that they weren't comfortable with. But again, the ultimate obedience is God, and you have to discern, is this what God's calling me to do? And it's easy in the sense if you truly believe that you're living in holy surrender to God and that God is active in all of our relationships.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mike
Kasubek.
Hey, Brother John, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I think it really goes to the heart of what the Celtic religion is. It's that you speak beautifully. I was thinking how, with all you said of the history, how all of us are affected by the culture we grew up in, the backgrounds we have, and how influential is the country we may live in. I mean, like, okay, Julius Caesar conquers Gaul before Christ, and that is a big change. That's a big influence. And so we tend to have the Roman influence. But I think the time, I don't know if you see this as a spiritual evolution, if I can use that term, where maybe we respect our differences of all religions, Buddhists, Hindus, and know that they're coming from this, respect the differences, know we're coming from a different background, but that we're all one in God, that we all share, and then we're going to a higher plane, perhaps. That's my wish anyway. But do you share any of those views?
Yes, I think so. God has many, many, many ways to speak to someone. And so who are we to say that we put God in this box to only speak this way? And again, it harkens back to the Celtic understanding that the light of Christ is within each person. They may express it in a different way, but the light, if you will, of God is in everyone. And it's just different ways of expressing it. Donna?
Thank you, Brother John. That was a lovely presentation. And I'm reminded of how the Celtic spirituality to me makes me feel surrounded and surrounded by the love of God, and helps me to feel the love of God within me. Just to mention, last summer, Marcus and I walked the St. Cuthbert Way. which was 70 miles up in Northumberland.
Right?
And we really, going back to your beginning of your presentation, when you were talking about the romantic notion of these spiritual folk long ago, having an easy life. We really came to know St. Cuthbert as one who worked very hard. We hiked from close to Melrose Abbey to Lindisfarne, crossing the tidal waters. And we learned that he would make these long hikes, long walks just about every day. And he was helping, along with others, to spread seeds, besides seeds of Christianity, but seeds of apples and growing new crops. So it was literally a very, very hard life, and made especially hard by the fact that he really wanted to be deeply internal. And yet he had to help to mend and continue Christianity after the Synod of Whitby, as that you mentioned, and to try to keep growing and to bridging the Celtic spirituality with the understandings from Rome.
But at Lindisfarne, he also had that little island off the side that would end up with water between it, so he could isolate himself from the rest of the community.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And Marion, I think, is next,
And then Chris.
and then Chris or Prill. Marion, you need to unmute.
Donna touched on it when she said that Rome and the Celts are coming together a little bit. And I'm listening through the ears of Richard Rohr, who is a member of the Roman Church, and yet, by gum, he sounds exactly like a Celt to me. So do you think that the Celtic influence, if you want to say it, is deepening in the whole church? That's my question.
Good question.
I think within the whole church, there is this desire for community and a greater understanding of each of our spiritualities and our relationship with God. First of all, I think that is really what's growing. I think when people see the Celtic spirituality, the points that are under there that we've talked about, it resonates well with many today. And so therefore, I think there is a draw towards it. I think people want to feel and know that God is there surrounding them, as close as a breath, which the Celtic spirituality shares. In one sense, not just from the Celtic standpoint, but there are those, and I'm probably one of them, who thinks that the dispersed monastic model is perhaps the model of the future church. Smaller communities that are focused on one another, that support one another and protect and grow, and that we are there in relationship, with that being important, perhaps the most important aspect. So there are those who think maybe that's down the road, this is where the church is heading.
Good. Chris or Prill, I think you had your hand up.
Hi, Prill and I have started studying and some collection of iconography of icons.
Mhm.
It was really triggered by my daughter bringing home, somewhat surreptitiously from Russia, a wonderful old Mary and Jesus icon from a church that she bought it at a flea market. But I've been really fascinated by the whole notion of the growth of iconography after Constantine and eventually the separation of the East and West, was there any artistic, that is visual artistic, or are there any visual artistic icons in the Celtic tradition?
Well, I think you have to decide where you're going to draw the timeline. The earliest, no, they didn't write anything down. They used wood for their chapels and for their dwellings. So none of that has survived. But then as you progress further along the way, you still maintain, as I said, when we went to the Roman structure for monasticism in Britain, the Celtic spirit was still within the monks. You know, they couldn't cut that out. They just followed the rules that Benedict had. And you start seeing the formation, the writing of icons. But I don't think and I'm not knowledgeable at all really on icons. We have some members of our community who do write icons, but I don't think that any would have survived if they were there early on.
Thank you.
And Reed is next.
One of the, there is a sort of an icon, if you think about it, John, the Book of the Kells
Well, yes.
is, and all of the highly carved stonework making the Celtic crosses, the
Right.
door jambs and all kinds of things like that are iconographic. And I think because of the coming together of the natural world with humanity, and that being a focus specifically for the Celts, which Rome wasn't so happy about, but it still gets its influence. You see throughout Britain, the altar, lots of high altars are decorated with a Jesse tree, which is a visual way of seeing how the church has grown, things like that. We learned so much being in Wales for all the time of my sabbatical from Boniface way back when I could walk the whole of the Lindisfarne, what do they call that? The causeway, Donna, I think.
Yeah.
And you just, and I could get there fast enough that the water didn't get on me. Now I would have to have somebody fly me there. But anyhow, that, I think what is happening in the whole of Anglicanism anyway, if you read the New Zealand prayer book, you see what a Celtic influence, although they say it's from the Maoris, but it is a coming together of the natural world with the aspect of humans and the sacrifice of Jesus and all of that, where Rome focuses there on human beings and on the sacrifice of Jesus. Celtic spirituality takes the whole of the universe in. St. Francis is a perfect example when he writes the Canticle to the Sun. He's very, very Celtic in his way of writing prayers and things.
Yeah, I think that perhaps the other way, and I agree with you, Reed, the way to look at it is that there is a source beyond Celtic or Franciscan. There's a common source, and the Maoit that we all recognize, and we just express it in perhaps just small differences, but a common origin way back beyond the Celtic.
Okay.
Amanda has her hand up.
Amanda?
Yeah, this is kind of piggybacking on to Reed. Would it be, I think it would be interesting to compare a Celtic worship service with our Anglican worship service and see, yeah, you look confused, or you look.
No, I'm, there are some of the early breviaries that you could look at.
What about a Celtic service of today?
Well, I've got some. I mean,
Yeah.
I've got some that have been used.
Yeah.
Eucharist. David Adams, who is a vicar at Lindisfarne, has written a beautiful little book of Celtic hours, because he had people who would be with him, and then they would go, and they said, well, we leave, but we don't have anything to use once we're at home. And so he wrote this book titled Rhythm of Life. And so there are different services out there, and I've got some that have been put together. We actually have a Eucharist we use within our community, especially when there's the profession of vows, when we're together we come together once a year for a week. And so there are Eucharists there. The basic outline follows what we have in the Episcopal Church, but we would use different prayers and such. Likewise, we're actually working on our own breviary in the very early stages, and we have written for our community our own morning prayer and evening prayer and noonday prayer at this point.
Well, I was just wondering if there would be a teaching and involved in looking at the two. If you think that it's not that way.
Well, I think that, and I know that some people, is it Dunedin that people have gone up to, and there's a service up there? I think Betsy and Vince have been up there. You can construct your own. I mean, just the prayers we've been looking at here, you can go back to these prayers and insert them into a service. You can write prayers that are focused more on nature and God's presence.
I guess I'm wondering about Eucharistic language, for instance, and the creeds. Is that all pretty
Yeah,
much the same?
I'll connect you up with a member of our community, Sister Donna Ruth, who has her PhD in historic theology, and she can help you a whole lot more on that than I can. But I mean, there are early services that would include the Eucharist from very early. But again, to me, it's an intellectual exercise, and that's not where I am.
Mhm.
Reed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Reed has his hand up again.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, Amanda, look up, if you have access on your computer, look up the New Zealand prayer book.
Oh, yeah, I have that.
Yeah,
I have.
and you see the thing that really influenced me in that way was their new translation of the Lord's Prayer, which is a whole lot longer than we know it,
Okay.
but it incorporates the whole of the universe. It's a beautiful piece.
Okay, I have that. It's home in Pennsylvania, but I do have that. I cherish.
Mine's in a box somewhere in the garage. I know I'll find it. Pray maybe before I die,
But as Reed said, you can find it online. So
Oh,
yeah, you can find it online.
okay, thank you. Yeah.
Just-
James? Oh, I thought was anyone else like to share anything?
Grace,
Grace?
Grace,
you're on mute.
there you go.
Okay.
If you could mute.
Brother John, I really enjoyed this, and I'm so glad you were able to do it again. As far as our best group at St. Boniface, it just was fantastic. I just loved the Celtic life with the earth around them and their care for the earth and the animals and the people. It was beautifully spoken. I was just jotting down some things, and I said, nature, the way they express God's power and breath and spirit and love, and learning to recognize God's voice and be guided to protect his creation, seeing God everywhere and in each other. And that's what we all try to do and strive for. I wanted to ask you one thing. Who was the king early on, the king who decided, I should know this, but who decided that the religion was going to be the Roman
It
side?
was Oswy. I can't remember the spelling of it. O-W something.
So
Is
it's no king that we knew quite well then.
No, oh, no. This is way, way back.
Is that Oswald in English?
I don't think so. I'm not sure.
Mhm.
But that was the turning point for the church.
Well, yeah, in the sense that at that point, the decision was made that we would go with the Roman approach to church, and rather than the Celtic. And then again, what happened was those Celts that couldn't put up with this went over to Ireland or held along the far west edge of Britain. And we then had a sense of the Benedictine communities coming in and helping the Celtic monastics to understand the Roman way of doing things.
Oh, interesting. I'll look it up.
And Reed?
Gracie, one of the things that we learned when we were doing a lot of study of Celtic spirituality was the fact that you could see the difference between Roman bishops and Celtic bishops. Celtic bishops walked everywhere with no shoes. Roman bishops rode everywhere and all dressed up.
And
Chris, here, I knew this was in the living room somewhere, but this is an idea of what Celtic iconography would look like. Highly stylized. Wait a minute, where's the cross? It's on the other one. One moment, please. You can see how highly decorated all of these things are, or illuminated. Isn't that the word they use, John?
yeah, illumination.
Illumination.
Reed, thanks very much. That's very nice. That's great.
Sure thing.
I think that's it.
Is that it, Reed? Yeah. John, excellent session. Your presentation has, stimulated a lot of thinking and reflection. One of the things that I'd like to piggyback on is the fact that you were saying the spirituality is actually universal of the Celtic awareness of creation. Hildegard used the term greening.
Right.
And that was her whole concept of God creating anew and bringing new life. And ecology was very important, even though that wasn't the word used at the time. So she is, female awareness of this whole concept. And I can't forget Matthew Fox and his creation spirituality. It is dovetails tremendously, hand in glove with Celtic spirituality.
Yeah.
So again, I think there is a rebirth and a wonderful awareness in our society of how we are all interconnected. And boy, if ever we need that awareness, it's today, because we're so divided. And this type of spirituality and this type of learning is critical, I think, for us to be able to live in peace and harmony with one another.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Grace, one of the thoughts I had when you were talking about best and such is keep in mind that for the early Celtic Christian, they saw God in the all of creation, but this was also survival. They recognized, you had to get along with the world around you or you're going to die.
True. True now.
Yeah, but they were more hands-on with it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, the violent storms and winds and snows that are assailing us at these times.
Yeah, and
Right.
people get upset when their power goes out for 24 hours or something.
Right.
Yeah. Jim,
Bob.
who- but we have,
When Freddie and I were in Ireland a couple of years ago, we were on the West Coast. We were, with all due respect to Reed and the bishops, we were being driven. We weren't walking. But the West Coast is really rough and humble, and beautiful at the same time. But we went right by one of the cottages that was the kind of a pre-potato famine cottage. And now that's the middle of the 19th century. And that was about as primitive as you could believe. It was startlingly primitive. And that's certainly kept in line with what we've been talking about in terms of
yeah, Bob, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, right now I'm reading a book, Living Buddha, Living Christ by Thich Nhat Hanh. I think that's the way it's pronounced.
Yeah.
Vietnamese monk. And the spirituality that he's discussing there is exactly what you're talking about, Brother John. And it illustrates, I think, the fact that the discovery of God, spirituality is not just a Celtic, Roman, or Western truth. It's found everywhere. And what he says is exactly comforting to me.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, we're over.
Okay. I think, John, we can wrap up.
Do you want to just?
Is there anything you want to say before we just mention the upcoming presentations?
Right, that's what I was going to do, is stop recording so I can go in and I'll bring up our coming attractions, as I call them. But again, thank you all for being here. Really
Thank you.
enjoyed the
Thank
discussion.
you.
I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording now.